Welcome to the Team Teach podcast. I'm Claire, and in each episode you'll find me talking with an expert guest to learn more about behaviour. We squeeze a lot into each episode. You'll listen to the latest thinking in behaviour, continue your professional development with our book recommendation, and then I'll send you away with 3 practical tips you can use in your setting. I'm joined today by Hannah Smart. Hannah is an executive head teacher of 2 special schools which are part of the Transforming Futures Multi-Academy Trust, based predominantly in Plymouth, but covering through their alternative provision and special educational needs schools most of the South West Peninsula. Hannah has been working in education for 24 years and has experience in both social, emotional, mental health and autism spectrum condition specialist settings, following time as a senior and middle leader in inner city schools in Bristol. And today, Hannah and I are talking about relational approaches to reduce incidents. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Hannah. How are you?
Hi, Claire. Very well, thank you. And you?
I am really well. I am very excited to have you on the podcast today. I'll be transparent with the listenership though, that I do know you and I do some work in one of your schools. But what has grabbed me as a practitioner of working within one of your settings and knowing another is your passion really for positive approaches and the relational approach within your schools. So that's primarily what we're talking about today and how that can reduce incidences. And I'm just really interested to hear kind of how it came about. But I want to start with our book recommendation just for the listeners.
Absolutely. So I've gone for an oldie but goodie, and it has 2 parts, which I would highly recommend both of them being read in conjunction with each other. So When the Adults Change, Everything Changes by Paul Dix. I think if you work in a school, it's probably been something that you've heard about, maybe even read, but certainly probably seen on a shelf for CPD somewhere. And the follow-up after the Adults Change, again, they're both just great books for putting your hands on, reading someone's words and getting the concrete ideas, strategies and suggestions that you can go and do. Because we talk about behaviour and it's so ultimately abstract because it's all about feelings and perceptions and thoughts. These 2 books together put the concrete into the abstract and say, when this feels like this, go do this. And ultimately, when you go and do those things, you are seeking to make the change happen. And whether it actually works or not is irrelevant. That sense of understanding something, applying it and trying it is ultimately the underpinning of any type of relational intervention or strategy, and being willing to keep going. These books are great idea stores for when you're feeling a bit unsure about where to go next.
Yeah, and I know, it is one that has been recommended a few times on the podcast, and I can really see why. As a practitioner, front facing, it's concrete, like you mentioned. But I think what's sometimes missed is how well Paul Dix writes, because we want something that's nice and easy to read, and he references various things, but it's not too heavy on the academic side. So I think on all notes it's such a great package. But
well, I know we share a trade originally as English teachers, so it does speak to my heart when I when I see a well-constructed text. So yes, that's definitely got a positive going for it as well. But I think ultimately what anyone's looking for is something to try. When you get to the stage of thinking, what can I do? It's really difficult when you're confronted with a whole load of academic theory. You hear the voice of the person, you can empathise with the experience of, oh yes, someone else feels like that. And if it worked for him, it could work for me. So ultimately, you're right. I think it's a great book and everyone should read it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hannah, for that one. And obviously we're focusing on that relational approach and our positive approaches and how that might reduce incidences in our setting. Just tell us a bit about your experience and kind of how you've come to that place with your headships.
Wow, there's a story. So I've been in teaching for 22 years this year, which is both a really short blink of an eye and an incredibly long time. And I think the answer to your question is really simple and short. I've learned how to do it because I've also tried what hasn't worked.
Yeah.
the background I've got, I came from an inner city Bristol comprehensive school, worked my way up through a couple of urban academies. I spent a considerable period of time at a coastal, rural, big comprehensive school as a deputy principal, having arrived, and the behaviour was all very behaviourist, i.e. child does X, adult does Y, consequence A, B or C is applied. And that journey took me to a place where I was really able to fine tune the personalized approach, but within the parameters of a policy. And sitting at that level as a senior leader, you absolutely must show an integrity with the policies and procedures of your school, but you also can't lose sight of the empathy and the needs of the individual in front of you. So that relational approach that worked for me in the classroom of treating others as you want to be treated and bringing the humanity of someone's lived experience to the fore allows you to develop the lens that says, why am I seeing this behaviour and what is it telling me? And ultimately, my step after being a deputy head in a mainstream upper school really was to move to a specialist SEMH setting for boys with residential provision, which was a step change and definitely challenged my relational practice in many ways. But as we know, from challenge comes growth and progression and opportunity. And I was lucky enough then to end up where I am now, really, which is head teacher of Ace Tiverton, but I'm also wonderfully blessed to be able to work across a second school, which is a primary setting for SEMH young people as part of our trust. So I'm able now to have the journey of a young person from early years right the way through to year 11. I've got plans for sixth form that may come about, you never know. And ultimately, everyone wants to be treated in a safe, emotionally intelligent, humane way. No one wants to get out of bed in the morning and be unkind or disrespectful. But when you have behaviours like that from a young person, it can be really difficult to see the communication rather than the behaviour. So whether it's through these books or whether it's through a lot of earned years, I think ultimately my style has been about thinking first and foremost, what would I want in this situation, or what would I want for my stepson or for my family? And that helps guide me in the best way forward for the individual that I'm dealing with.
Yeah, and it's that values-based approach and that humanist approach really comes out from the descriptions that you were talking about within your experience. And I'm thinking with such a wealth of experience, I just wondered for the listenership if you could talk about the successes perhaps that you've seen with that relational approach and the positive approaches in any of the settings that you've worked in.
I think success around relational approaches comes in two forms. You have the case study of the young person who has arrived, when you're a classroom teacher, at your door with the history. They're the one that's talked about in the staff room, or they're part of a well-known family or have a particular surname. And ultimately, when a young person arrives in your classroom, you have a choice as an adult as to whether the voices that you hear, the story, the reputation, what this young person may have done in another setting or another room, is that more valuable than the young person themselves? Because when you take your first step as an interaction with someone, you're bringing that value to the forefront, because you're either seeing that young person through the lens of everyone else's story, or you're prepared to create your own story. And I think sometimes, and I certainly fell into this as a younger teacher, people don't always know that they're relational practitioners. It's part of who they are, and that may speak to them as an individual or how they were raised. The nature nurture debate is one for another podcast probably. But I think ultimately the success of the relational approach is seen in two ways. One is those young people that come through despite what everyone else says, has success in your classroom, makes progress because of the connection that you've made with them. And then you've got the group of staff. So as a head and as a leader, my successes are, unfortunately, some might say, less now about the children, but more about the adults, and bringing adults with me and developing their trust and confidence that they are relational practitioners, when perhaps, particularly at the moment, I would say I'm meeting a lot of either new practitioners or practitioners from mainstream who are very used to having a framework, almost as I talked about earlier, child X does this,
Yeah.
teacher does
Yeah.
this, and you just follow the steps, rather than encouraging staff to use their instincts, to use their humanity, and accepting that that means that there will be some personalization, some different, some adaptive approaches. And that's not a bad thing, because ultimately, when any young person, as with us as employees now, when we have a problem or when there's an issue, we get met first with, how can we help? What's the best thing for you? Not just, you've been off for a day, therefore I send you this letter. And I think that there's a disconnect sometimes between the way we prepare young people for the wider world through our behaviour systems in schools and the world that they're going to go out and navigate, because unless we start to treat them in a way an employer really would, we're not giving them the capacity or independence to make good choices about their behaviours, their attendance, and all those other things.
If you work with parents and carers, our family engagement training equips you with the skills, knowledge, and understanding to build positive relationships. Help your families understand and support their child's behaviour, recognise the challenges and opportunities in your organisation, and receive an exclusive range of resources you can use to practically support your families. Take a look at this exciting training option on the Team Teach website. It's like that idea of spoon feeding everything, isn't it? Where we lack the drive, I suppose, to create that independent young person, that independent child, so that that person is able to make reasonable decisions for themselves. And if it's, I don't know, I don't hand in homework, I immediately get a consequence. I'm not really learning about anything. I'm just gaining a consequence, probably getting quite annoyed by it. And I think it's really interesting, the kind of behaviourist versus other approaches. And I think it's interesting to see the impact that it can have. And I've worked in both, similar to you. I've worked in mainstream through to SEN and social emotional mental health. And one thing I've kind of learned about consequences, particularly in social emotional mental health and SEN settings, is that they really have absolutely zero impact unless you have some sort of relationship with the person. I remember in a people referral unit, I had one lad that we called them red slips. I mean, it's probably not a great name for it, but he had red slips all the time from certain teachers, meant nothing. And I remember in one lesson, I hardly ever gave out red slips in my practice, and he really pushed the boundaries. And this sort of 15-year-old really street smart lad was almost in tears when I was giving him a red slip, because it meant something. It meant that he'd crossed a boundary, and because of our relationship, it impacted him. And I obviously don't want to make teenage individuals cry. That isn't part of my practice. But the meaningfulness of the consequence is completely lost if I haven't spent the time to build the relationship.
Absolutely. And again, listening to you, I can hear two things happening out there in the world of the listener. Perhaps that the mainstream practitioner, and we probably remember this well, 30 kids, 6 classes a day. How on earth can you, in a school of 1,800, make relationships in the sort of way that we might be alluding to when it comes to smaller SEN classes? We have 10 in a class here at Tiverton. But I think that the truth is, it's very possible to make those connections. And for me, it goes back to that value that you place on your relationship with the young person. Because one thing, teenagers particularly, and secondary is my sort of specialty, if anything, is one thing young people are very good at is instinct. And I've heard some people compare them to the sort of dog instincts of if you're scared of them or feel intimidated and show that, then that's something that they can really easily pick up on. And that is true. And that is also really unfortunate, particularly in schools where there is a very transactional behaviourist approach, i.e. do this, then do that, because actually it doesn't in any way, shape or form skill staff up to acknowledge that they feel that way, because it's okay to feel fearful and intimidated. It's not okay to not be supported to work through that. And I think when you end up or to equip a colleague or peer with skills to be able to address that. And I think when we look back at some of the practices in mainstream through the lens of having experienced SEMH settings or ASC settings, as I'm in at the moment, it's really easy to see how that fear actually is implicit at leadership level, because it is scary to be faced when I'm a 5'2" woman with a 6'3" 15-year-old who is, you know, determined to get his own way. But also it is possible to talk them down from the edge and for them not to get what they want no matter what. And that isn't all about having 10 in a class. It's not all about being in a small setting. It's about the skills and talents and willingness of the staff to see beyond what you've got right in front of you and to build the connection so that the next time it happens, there's a hook. Because that red slip, as you talked about, does have value. The impact on it on that young man showed that. But I guarantee that the next time you talk to him about a red slip, he probably stood back from some of those behaviours because he'd know that you were doing it. And sometimes you have to take them through the consequence, which should be natural, logical, explained, and for my ASC learners, rooted in the parameters of the real world to make it concrete, not just because I didn't like what they were doing. And when you are able to get a young person understanding, even though they don't like it, then those consequences become equally as powerful. So connection creates consequence, because the consequence, when it's understood and applied, then has value and weight. But all of those things can't happen unless you've put value into your relationship in the first place.
I'm really conscious of time. Hannah's really desperate to say more about that. Go on, do it. Add it in.
Very quickly, what I don't want people to take away is that a relational approach, and sometimes the trauma-informed approach, gets seen as an easy option. The most important thing about the relational approach is, yes, treating others as you want to be treated and using your warmth as a tool, but ultimately boundaries keep young people safe. Consequences reinforce those boundaries, and it's absolutely okay to ensure that as an adult you are clear with young people about the boundaries, about what's okay and what's not, and to challenge them on that, because you can't have a relational approach with integrity that is valued by the child as well as the adult if you ignore stuff. So the relational approach, ironically, in the way that it's sometimes looked at, is predicated on focusing on the detail and not walking past anything, because anything you ignore is what you're giving an unconscious acceptance message to. So ultimately, relationships is about noticing, caring, and acting.
And I'm really glad you did add that in, because I think when we, you know, experienced practitioners, we get into that relational approach and talking about it. But the essence that you've described there is absolutely fantastic. If you give us your 3 tips, Hannah, on this topic, that would be great.
I will do, and they're going to be sort of key potted highlights really of the more detailed narrative that I've given. So firstly, consider how you like to be treated at work and replicate that for your pupils. Being seen is a central part of our willingness to work for someone. So that value, that noticing, and that can take the form of reinforcing boundaries and remembering what you will tolerate from someone and reinforcing that with them. Thinking about the way you make time for people. We are all busy, get that completely, but actually 30 seconds of a chat at lesson changeover, break time, seeing them in the dining hall, those things are the really unseen elements that build up the bank account of a relationship with a young person and can be hugely powerful. And that speaks then to my final point, which is that every interaction is an intervention. Every time you interact, and that can be non-verbal, which again, if we have more time, I'd talk about, because that's really an underplayed skill set within the relational approach. It's not about me naming you or calling you out or shaming you, because that's a really toxic experience. It's about me using my presence, using my location around the classroom to just gently remind, guide, control, reframe those lane boundaries so that everyone's really focused and on it. And actually, when you own the space that you're in, often those relationships will flourish much more quickly, because students will see seen and connected with as you move around the room.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Hannah. We've got such a wealth of experience, knowledge and kindness as well within that interview. So really appreciate your time, and I'll catch up with you soon.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Team Teach podcast. It's been great to have you here with us as we discuss behaviour, communication and the ways we can best support those in our care. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.